Welcome to the first episode in a Legendarium series about the life of King Edward II of England. In this episode, The King's Favorite, we will talk about how the young king's obsession with a young knight named Piers Gaveston turned into toxic favoritism, and this, combined with a failed war in Scotland, led to rising dissent among the nobles of England, who were eventually led by the king's own cousin, the Earl of Lancaster, in a bloody revolt. Edward II was born on April 25th, 1284, the fourth son of King Edward I and Queen Eleanor of Castile. Edward had three older brothers who died in childhood, making Edward II Edward I's eldest son and heir to his throne. Edward I had Dominican friars educate his son, and Edward II showed great generosity to the Dominican monks throughout his life in gratitude for this education. By 1300, Edward II was literate, possessed a small library, and spoke Latin, French, and English. He enjoyed music, acting, and swimming. An accomplished horseman, he nonetheless rarely fought in tournaments. Even when he was a teenager, his father Edward I began grooming him to rule, making Edward II Prince of Wales in 1301, the first Englishman to ever hold this title. However, Edward I hoped to inspire his son to military greatness as well. To that end, Edward I introduced a heroic young soldier named Piers Gaveston to his son, hoping to provide Edward II with a role model. And in a tragic irony, Edward II instead became obsessed with Piers Gaveston, whom he called his brother. Basking in the prince's favor, the once well-mannered and courageous Gaveston grew increasingly arrogant and obnoxious. In 1305, Edward II got into a bitter quarrel with Walter Langdon, his father's treasurer. Edward I punished his son by cutting his allowance and banishing several men from Edward II's household, among them Gaveston. However, the first of Gaveston's exiles lasted only a year. He was allowed back into England for the Feast of Swans, an elaborate chivalric feast where Edward I knighted his son, and then Edward II in turn knighted 266 squires so they could fight in the Scottish War. Afterwards, Piers, Edward II, and many other squires joined King Edward in the Scottish War, by then nearing its second decade. The 1306 campaign proved to be a success for the English, ending with their taking Lochmaden Castle. However, Piers Gaveston absconded from King Edward's winter quarters that same year with 21 other knights to join the tournament season in France. Enraged, King Edward made all the wayward knights exiles. In the coming months, King Edward I allowed 21 of the 22 knights to return, but Edward insisted that Gaveston remain an exile. Even then, King Edward feared the unhealthy obsession that his son had with Gaveston. King Edward hoped to focus his son's mind on his new bride. In December 1307, Edward II married Isabella of France in a grand ceremony attended by 5 kings and 3 queens. Not long after, King Edward I died and Edward II took the throne. Edward II's first act as king was to recall Gaveston from exile, grant him the earldom of Cornwall, and then arrange his marriage to one of the richest women in England, Margaret de Clare. These marriages and titles granted him not only royal status, but annual income of £4,000 a year. Bestowing such a gift on a favorite rather than one of his own kinsmen was shocking and dangerous. And Edward II's coronation made his toxic favoritism for Piers Gaveston even more clear. On February 25, 1308, Edward II was coronated King of England in a ceremony attended by the nobility of both England and France, all dressed in gold cloth, as King Edward II entered the Abbey Church, himself wearing a green robe with black trousers and walking barefoot on a carpet of flowers with his young bride. All the nobles of England marched before the royal couple, carrying great swords, the royal scepter, and heavy coronation robes. However, Edward shocked all of the nobles by placing Gaveston at the front of the procession, dressed in purple robes decorated with pearls, thus outdoing the nobles who dressed in mere gold cloth. Gaveston also got the honor of putting on the king's boots during the ceremony. Even worse, King Edward II refused to put up Queen Isabella's arms, but instead put up those of himself and Gaveston. Edward II also gave coronation jewels intended for Isabella of France to Gaveston. The Queen's two uncles were so outraged by the insults heaped upon their niece that they stormed out and took most of the French delegation with them. Any goodwill between France and England that might have come from the royal marriage vanished. Given the depth of Edward's obsession with Gaveston, many at the time wondered if the king and Piers Gaveston were lovers. We don't know for sure if they were or not, but it didn't matter. It was the king's obsession with Gaveston and his shameless favoritism that enraged and appalled the great lords of England. During the reign of Edward I, parliaments were held often and served as forums for debate, discussion, and negotiation. Edward I realized that Parliament provided a healthy outlet for dissent and gave a wise king the chance to make allies. Unfortunately, Edward II was not a wise king. Aware of how much his antics during the coronation enraged the nobles, in April 1308, before the first Parliament of his reign even met, King Edward II had bridges leading to London broken down, and he himself took refuge in Windsor Castle with Piers Gaveston. Nonetheless, Parliament still met and demanded that Gaveston be sent into exile. Unwilling to banish his dear friend, Edward instead made Gaveston Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, granting him manors and estates to support himself in royal style. Afterwards, King Edward II embraced a reform program to win over the nobles. He forbade the seizure of goods for the royal army. He also ended abuses of power by the king's officials. However, all of these good works were done to lull the barons into allowing Piers Gaveston back into England in 1309. Once he returned, Gaveston became more obnoxious than ever. He came up with insulting nicknames for the great lords of England, calling them names like Burst Belly, Churl, and Black Dog. After Gaveston's return, Edward II decided to continue his father's campaign against the Scots. The king's many shortcomings might have been forgiven if he defeated the Scots, but his sword proved soft indeed. Robert the Bruce, the leader of the Scots, waged guerrilla warfare against the English and recaptured most of the castles in Scotland. To learn more about the Scot guerrilla war against Edward II, check out my video on James Douglas, with the link in the description below. These Scottish victories triggered a fresh wave of protest within Parliament, which focused anger squarely on Gaveston. Earl Thomas of Lancaster, the king's own cousin, became the leader of the opposition. Lancaster accused Gaveston of stealing from the royal coffers, something he likely did not do. But it didn't matter. For the barons, Gaveston became a scapegoat for the failing war effort. Lancaster assembled a coalition of the infuriated, called the Ordainers, which moved to strip the king of the powers he misused. Desperate to avoid Lancaster and his Ordainers, King Edward II took Gaveston and an army of 3,000 to Scotland himself. Robert the Bruce refused to give battle, retreating deep into Scotland. And when King Edward II finally withdrew in defeat, the Bruce responded with raids into England, burning villages and grain, bringing hardship and hunger to Edward's subjects. Lancaster again accused Gaveston of sabotaging the war effort by stealing taxes and demanded his exile. Once more, Edward gave in to the barons. Only a few weeks later, Edward again recalled Gaveston. And in a shockingly brazen act, Edward II issued a proclamation announcing Gaveston's return that to be read in every town in England. Within weeks of Gaveston returning, Lancaster and his allies mustered men to hunt them down. King Edward put together a royal convoy to try to take Piers Gaveston to safety in Scotland. With Lancaster's men catching up, King Edward abandoned everything in a desperate attempt to save Gaveston. He left behind the royal baggage train, he left behind some of the crown jewels, he even abandoned his wife, Isabella of France, then 5 months pregnant with the future King Edward III, all in a desperate attempt to save Gaveston, and all was for naught. In May 1312, the rebel nobles captured Gaveston at Scarborough Castle. Gaveston fell into the hands of the Earl of Warwick, who marched him on foot, with crowds turning out to pelt him with insults and dung. Upon Gaveston's arrival at Warwick Castle, Lancaster himself convened a kangaroo court with men handpicked by himself. Gaveston could not even speak in his defense. This mockery of a trial was technically illegal under royal law, but Lancaster didn't care. After the show trial finished, Gaveston was handed over to armed retainers who marched him to Blacklow Hill. Though he pleaded for mercy, in growing panic, the retainers chopped off Gaveston's head. Gaveston's body remained lying on the ground until 2 Dominican friars retrieved it. Remembering Edward's generosity to their order, the monks sewed Gaveston's head back on, embalmed his body, and draped it with gold cloth in their abbey. Gaveston would only be buried 3 years later. If Lancaster hoped to reunite England with Gaveston's murder, he failed. A grieving and heartbroken Edward swore revenge upon the nobles who had murdered his favorite, and the split between the king and the rebel barons led to many more murders in years to come. We'll talk about those in the next episode. That wraps things up for this episode of The Legendarium. I hope you enjoyed it. If you like what you saw, press like. If you want to see more, press subscribe. And if you've got anything to say, let me know in the comments section. Thanks again for joining me, and I hope that you have a great rest of the day.